David Letterman's pencil fell from his hand when Paul Newman suddenly stood up, walked to the window overlooking Manhattan, and said 7 words that would haunt everyone in the studio. Paul Schaefer's piano went silent. The audience forgot to breathe. And for the next 9 minutes, the most handsome man in Hollywood, the man with those legendary blue eyes, stopped being a movie star and became something else entirely. What happened that night wasn't an interview. It was a reckoning. And NBC would spend years trying to decide if America was ready to see their golden boy this broken. It was a Monday night in April 1985, and Late Night with David Letterman was hitting its stride. The show had been on the air for 3 years now, and David Letterman, 38 years old, with his signature curly brown hair and self-deprecating humor, had become the alternative voice in late-night television. He sat behind his wooden desk in Studio 6A at 30 Rockefeller Plaza, reviewing his notes before the next segment. The monologue had been sharp. The audience was engaged. Paul Schaefer and the band were in perfect form. Everything felt right. Letterman glanced at his cue cards and did a double-take. "Wait, Paul Newman is here tonight?" The producer nodded from offstage. "Confirmed. He's in the green room right now." "Paul Newman doesn't do talk shows," Letterman said, genuinely surprised. "He called us 2 weeks ago," the producer said. "Said he wanted to come on. Wouldn't say why. No movie to promote, no book. Just said he had something he wanted to talk about." That was unusual. Paul Newman was one of the biggest movie stars in the world. Cool Hand Luke, Butch Cassidy, and the Sundance Kid, The Sting, The Verdict. He was Hollywood royalty, and he famously avoided the talk show circuit, preferring to let his work speak for itself. "Did he give any hint what he wants to discuss?" Letterman asked. "None. Just said it was important." Letterman felt a small knot of nervousness in his stomach. "Okay then, 30 seconds. The stage manager called out. Letterman straightened his tie, took a breath, and looked into the camera as the red light blinked on. "Welcome back," Letterman said. "Our next guest is someone I never thought we'd get on this show. He's one of the greatest actors of all time. He's been in more classic films than I can count. He's Paul Newman. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Paul Newman." The audience exploded into applause and cheers. Paul Schaefer hit a smooth, confident jazz riff on the keyboard, and the band launched into a sophisticated groove. And from backstage, moving with quiet grace, Paul Newman walked out. He was 60 years old, but he still had that undeniable presence. He wore a simple navy blazer over a light blue shirt, jeans, and loafers. His hair was silver now, but those eyes, those famous and possibly blue eyes, were exactly as everyone remembered them. He moved like someone who was comfortable in his own skin, but there was something else in his expression, something tired. The audience was on its feet, giving him a standing ovation before he even reached the desk. Paul smiled that famous Newman smile and waved casually. He shook Letterman's hand firmly, then settled into the guest chair. He sat back, one leg crossed over the other, and looked directly at Letterman with those piercing blue eyes. "Paul, thank you so much for being here," Letterman said, and the genuine awe in his voice was evident. "Thanks for having me, Dave," Paul said. His voice was smooth, measured, with that distinctive quality that had made him one of the great actors. "I have to say, I'm shocked you're here," Letterman admitted. "You don't do many talk shows." "I don't do any talk shows," Paul corrected with a slight smile. "So why now?" Paul was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "Because I'm 60 years old, and I realized I've spent my entire adult life being watched but never really seen. And I thought maybe it was time to change that." The audience went still. That wasn't the answer anyone expected. Letterman leaned forward slightly. That's a heavy way to start." "You asked," Paul said simply. "I did," Letterman acknowledged. "So let's talk about it. What do you mean by watched but never really seen?" Paul looked out at the audience, then back at Letterman. "I mean, people have been looking at my face for 40 years. They've watched me in movies, seen me on magazine covers, stared at these eyes," he gestured to his face, "and made assumptions about who I am based on what I look like. But nobody's ever really asked who I actually am underneath all that." He paused. "And to be honest, I'm not sure I know the answer anymore." The studio was completely silent now. Paul Schaefer had stopped moving at his keyboard. Letterman's expression had shifted. The ironic distance was gone. "Paul, that's incredibly honest." "Well, I didn't come here to be dishonest," Paul said. "I get enough of that in my regular life." "What do you mean by that?" Paul uncrossed his legs and leaned forward slightly. "I mean, everyone wants something from Paul Newman, the movie star. They want autographs. They want photos. They want to tell me how much they love me in this movie or that movie. And that's fine. I understand that comes with the territory. But nobody ever wants to know about Paul the person. Paul the guy who likes to race cars because it's the only place nobody's staring at his face. Paul the guy who makes salad dressing in his basement because it gives him something real to do with his hands. The audience laughed nervously at the salad dressing reference, but Paul wasn't smiling. I'm serious, Paul continued. I started making that salad dressing because I needed to create something that had nothing to do with these eyes or this face. Something that was just mine, that I could control, that wasn't about being looked at. Letterman was completely focused now. That sounds lonely. It is lonely, Paul said quietly. It's the loneliest thing in the world to be recognized everywhere you go, but never really known. To have millions of people think they know you because they've seen you play characters on a screen. What Paul said next would change everything in the room. Paul stood up suddenly. Letterman's eyes widened slightly in surprise. I need to move, Paul said. Is that okay? Of course, Letterman said. Paul walked away from the guest chair toward the tall windows that overlooked Manhattan. The cameras scrambled to follow him. He stood there for a moment, hands in his pocket, looking out at the city light. Then he turned back to face Letterman and the audience. Can I tell you something I've never told anyone publicly? Paul asked. Please, Letterman said. I hate being handsome, the audience gasped. Someone laughed nervously, thinking it was a joke, but Paul's face was completely serious. I know how that sounds, Paul continued. Poor Paul Newman, blessed with good looks and a successful career. Cry me a river, right? But I'm being serious. I've spent my entire adult life being reduced to a face, to a pair of eyes. People magazine calls me sexiest man alive. Women stare at me in restaurants. Men want to be me. And all of it is based on something I had nothing to do with. I didn't earn these eyes. I didn't work for this face. I was just born with it. He walked slowly back toward the stage. And you know what the worst part is? It made me a movie star, but I'm not sure it made me a good actor. Every role I've ever gotten, I've had to wonder, did they cast me because I'm talented or because I look good on camera? Every time someone compliments my performance, I think, are they really seeing my work, or are they just distracted by my face? His voice was getting rougher now. I've spent 40 years trying to prove I'm more than just a pretty face, and I don't know if I've succeeded. I don't know if anyone's ever looked past the surface to see the actual person underneath. Letterman's eyes were glistening. Paul, I think. Let me finish, Paul said gently. Please. Letterman nodded. Paul walked back to the guest chair but didn't sit down. He stood behind it, hands gripping the back. I'm 60 years old, Paul said. My hair is gray. My face has wrinkles. And you know what I feel? Relief. Because maybe, finally, people will stop staring at me like I'm some kind of object and start actually listening to what I have to say. Maybe when I'm old and these eyes don't have that same effect anymore, people will actually see me as a human being instead of a poster on a wall. He looked directly into the camera. If you're watching this at home right now, and you're young and good-looking, and you think that's the key to happiness, let me tell you something. It's not. Being beautiful is a cage. It's a beautiful cage, sure, but it's still a cage. People treat you differently. They make assumptions. They project their fantasies onto you. And after a while, you start to lose yourself in all those projections. You start to become what they want you to be instead of who you actually are. The silence in the studio was profound. I have a wife who loves me, Paul continued. Joanne. We've been married for 27 years. And you know why our marriage works? Because she's the only person in my life who doesn't give a damn about my eyes. She looks past them. She sees me, the real me, the guy who's insecure and anxious and worried he's not good enough, the guy who's tired of performing all the time, the guy who just wants to be normal. His voice cracked slightly. And I'm terrified that when these looks finally fade completely, when I'm just some old man and not Paul Newman the movie star anymore, I won't know who I am, because I've spent so long being defined by something external that I'm not sure there's anything internal left. Letterman stood up from behind his desk. He walked over to Paul. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Paul, Letterman said quietly, I think there's more to you than you realize. I think the fact that you're standing here saying all this proves there's something real underneath everything else. Paul's eyes were wet now. You think so? I know so, Letterman said. Paul nodded slowly. Then he looked out at the audience. I'm sorry if this isn't what you came here to see, Paul said. I know you probably wanted funny stories about working with Robert Redford or anecdotes from movie sets, but I needed to say this. I needed someone to know that Paul Newman the movie star is exhausted, and Paul the person is just trying to figure out who he is. The audience began to applaud, slowly at first, then building into something enormous. But it wasn't the usual celebrity applause. It was different, deeper, more human. Paul wiped his eyes quickly. "Thanks," he said softly. But Paul wasn't finished. He settled back into the guest chair. The energy in the room had shifted completely. "Can I tell you one more thing?" he asked. "Anything," Letterman said. "The reason I make salad dressing and race cars," Paul said with a faint smile, "is because I'm trying to find something that's mine. Something that proves I exist beyond this face. When I'm in a race car, nobody's looking at my eyes. They just want to know if I can drive. When people buy the dressing, they're not buying a movie star. They're buying something that tastes good. Those are the only two things in my life that feel real. Everything else feels like a performance." "Even acting?" Letterman asked gently. "Especially acting," Paul said, "because then I'm pretending to be someone else. And the rest of the time, I'm pretending to be Paul Newman. I'm always on, and I'm exhausted." Letterman's voice softened. "What do you want, Paul?" Paul thought for a long moment. The studio waited with him. "I want to be invisible," he finally said, "just for a day. I want to walk down a street, sit in a diner, exist without being watched. Because I think if I could do that, if I could just be nobody for a little while, I might figure out who I actually am." He smiled sadly. "These eyes are a brand now. They're everywhere. And the person behind them? He's nowhere." Letterman didn't interrupt. He stood and pulled Paul into a quiet hug. Paul's shoulders shook slightly. "Thank you for listening," Paul said to the audience. "Thank you for seeing me." He walked off stage to a standing ovation that built slowly, almost reverently. Letterman turned to the camera. "Paul Newman didn't come here to promote anything," he said, his voice unsteady. "He came here to tell the truth, and I think we needed to hear it." The show cut to commercial. The next morning, NBC received over 15,000 calls. Some viewers complained it was uncomfortable. Most said thank you. The episode aired once. It was never rerun. But the impact was immediate. Letters poured in. Sales of Newman's Own surged, not because of promotion, but because people wanted to support the man behind the image. One letter from a young actor read, "I've been told I'm too handsome to be taken seriously. Thank you for giving me permission to be more than my face." Paul kept it in his wallet for the rest of his life. Years later, Letterman was asked if he regretted airing the episode. "No," he said. "It's the most important thing we ever did. Paul trusted us with something real." They became friends. Once, Paul told him, "That was the first time I felt like myself on television." After Newman's death, NBC released a short clip. It went viral. The full episode remains locked away, but those who were in Studio 6A never forgot it. Paul Newman continued acting, racing, and building a company that gave hundreds of millions to charity. He never did another talk show. Near the end of his life, he said, "I only regret not being that honest sooner." In Letterman's office hangs a photo of Paul from that night, standing by a window, unguarded, human. Beside it is a note. "Some cages are beautiful, but they're still cages. You gave me a key." On difficult nights, Letterman looks at it and remembers the moment Paul Newman stopped performing and started living. And he remembers that being seen is not the same as being known, and that the bravest thing you can do is let someone see past the surface, especially when it's terrifying.